In the winter of 2025, as Trump headed back into the Oval Office with Elon Musk by his side, there seemed to be two potential countries in their crosshairs. One was Iran, which has been the white whale of neoconservatives for decades now. The other was Mexico, which is more of a Trump thing. I knew I wanted to do a video on why another war would be a bad idea and ultimately decided on pursuing Mexico, in part because of its relevance to some of our past videos, and in part because of Trump's unique fixation on it, and in part because of a recent discussion of a potential military offensive on the Joe Rogan Experience. On a November episode of his show, Rogan sat down with guest Evan Hafer. I had never heard of this guy specifically, but I had felt his impact. Hafer is the founder of Black Rifle Coffee, a coffee company known for its partnerships with all kinds of online right-wing pundits, as well as the UFC, since they've been shifting more towards it being an overtly Trump-friendly organization. On their website, Black Rifle describes itself as a, quote, SOF veteran-founded coffee company serving premium coffee and culture to people who love America. It also tells us that Hafer served in both Afghanistan and Iraq, which makes him more than qualified enough to talk geopolitics with Joseph. Hafer's appearance on November 15th, 2024 was 4.5 hours long. I'm sure he had a lot of really important insights over the course of the interview, but for our purposes, I'll be focusing on one 2-minute clip where Hafer talks about the United States taking military action against drug traffickers in Mexico.
If they turned loose Delta Force and SEAL Team 6 on cartels and pedophiles, we could just kind of like erase the problem in about 2 years. It'd be gone.
Now, the old Rogan would have provided some polite pushback to the idea of launching a war against one of America's closest allies and trading partners, but instead, he simply replied with,
"Bro, it is going to get wild."
Thank you for that, Joseph. Now, under normal circumstances, we could brush this off as a couple of millionaires chatting it up on a podcast, but unfortunately, this idea has been pushed by a number of other guests on Rogan's show, including President Donald Trump and one of his chief advisors, Elon Musk. And given that the second Trump administration has been far more aggressive in implementing his preferred policies relative to his first administration, I think this idea is worth taking seriously. So in this video, I'm going to tell you, the viewer, as well as Joseph Rogan, the podcaster, and Donald Trump, the president, a story of the US unleashing their military on a country with the goal of eradicating drug trafficking. Not only did they not succeed in 2 years as Hafer suggested they would, they fought this war for 20 years. And not only did they not eradicate drugs, this country became the biggest narco state on the planet. I am, of course, referring to Afghanistan, a country that both Hafer and Trump should be intimately familiar with. But if you, Joseph Rogan, or anyone else watching this, are not familiar with the most interesting country in the world, I'll take you back to the beginning to explain how America lost the drug war in Afghanistan. Now, if you've watched any of our videos before, you already know a thing or two about the last 50 years of Afghan history and how this all culminated in them becoming the world's largest heroin producer. But if you're new here, I'll give you the short version. Under the rule of King Zahir Shah, Afghanistan began to liberalize somewhat, particularly in the capital city of Kabul. As the city began to modernize and free speech was increasingly permitted on university campuses, the youth became increasingly radicalized into becoming communists or Islamic theocrats. After a series of coups led the small and not particularly popular Communist Party into power, Afghanistan's Islamic radicals regrouped in Pakistan. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to assassinate the murderous and unpopular communist president Hafizullah Amin to replace him with a slightly less murderous but equally unpopular communist president, the CIA wanted to get involved. But they couldn't do so directly without risking alerting the Soviet Union and potentially escalating the conflict further. So instead, they funneled billions of dollars through the Pakistani intelligence service, the ISI. The problem with this was that much of the ISI were staunch Islamists, who largely shared these funds with like-minded Afghans who had fled their country. The chief recipient of CIA money was the most radical among them, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. He made a name for himself in Afghanistan as the man who directed his followers to throw acid in the faces of women who didn't cover themselves appropriately, and quickly became known in Pakistan as someone who ran his guerrilla organization like a mob boss, assassinating his rivals at any opportunity. For the purposes of our story, though, we can understand Hekmatyar as a prolific heroin trafficker. Now, heroin trafficking has always existed in Afghanistan to some extent. Poppy is an ideal crop for poor farmers because it pays far better than crops like wheat, but it's also fairly resistant to drought, and its capsules contain hundreds of seeds for future crops. It was also a convenient choice because the Afghan climate is hospitable to poppy, and the process of turning opium into heroin is quite simple. You sow your poppy seeds, let them sprout with bright red flowers, wait for the petals to fall away to get at the plant's hardened capsule, squeeze it until the white liquid comes out, let it solidify, scrape it off, and repeat until the plant stops producing gum. You slap the gum into a cake, keep it wet until you hand it off to a drug dealer who will have it processed in a lab and turn it into a fine white powder, thus making heroin. But historically, whatever the Afghans produced was largely sold to their neighbors in Iran and Pakistan, which had fairly small addict populations. They would go on to produce enough that they were censured by the International Narcotics Board in the late 60s and early 70s, but production was concentrated in just a handful of provinces. A couple of things worked to change this. The more innocuous was that a drought hit the Golden Triangle in Asia, dropping their opium harvest by over 50% in 1980, giving Afghan and Pakistani actors the ability to expand production and eat up a larger share of the market. Another contributing factor was that the mass resistance against Afghanistan's brutal communist government and their even more ruthless Soviet occupiers weakened the Afghan state's capacity to police areas controlled by the Mujahideen's rebel forces resisting them. And generally speaking, it's these unpoliced areas that tend to turn into trafficking hubs. But perhaps the most sinister piece of the puzzle leading to the explosion of Afghanistan's heroin trade was the CIA protection shielding the traffickers from prosecution. Now, when this relationship started, Afghan intellectuals and other Democrats living in exile in Pakistan warned the US that funneling billions of dollars to a bunch of gangster religious extremists was a bad idea. The American diplomats responded by giving Gulbuddin Hekmatyar specifically over $1 billion, which he used to great effect, building 6 heroin refineries in Afghanistan, while his allies in the Pakistani ISI became extremely wealthy off of trafficking massive amounts of heroin all over the globe. After the Soviets ultimately withdrew, the chaos continued as Afghanistan descended into civil war and various Mujahideen factions fought to control the country. With the communists out of the way, the CIA stopped providing funding, meaning that the guerrillas were further incentivized to traffic heroin to make ends meet. For years, the country descended deeper into warlordism, and both the Afghan and Pakistani economies became fully dependent on the drug trade, with dire consequences for the rest of the world. By 1992, the CIA estimated that the drug trade in Pakistan was the same size as the legitimate economy, while cases of HIV soared all over Eastern Europe, with much of this attributed to injected drugs, and Iranian border guards were killed in the thousands while their addict population tripled by 2001. Order wasn't restored until the Taliban swept themselves into power and established a brutal theocracy. At first, they were happy to tolerate the poppy farming and even conjured up an Islamic justification for it. But as time went on, the Taliban regime sought diplomatic recognition and struggled to get it because of the way they treated women and harbored enemies of America like Osama bin Laden. At the behest of the UN, they decided to ban the opium trade rather than liberalize their stances on women and terror. So through violent reprisals and an understanding of how to negotiate with the locals, they forced opium production to drop by 94%, making it one of the most successful anti-drug campaigns of all time. This meant that when Americans invaded Afghanistan in the wake of 9/11, opium production was the lowest it had been in over 20 years. So what happened when the brave men and women of the US Armed Forces showed up in Afghanistan? The country became the biggest heroin producer the world had ever seen. Now, to understand how the heroin trade immediately reasserted itself, we need to first recognize that the Taliban completely crushing heroin overnight was almost certainly unsustainable. A huge amount of the country built their livelihood on growing or processing poppy. These were largely not drug kingpins. They were illiterate farmers who recognized that producing opium cakes made them far more money than wheat did. And I mean far more. In 2003, the yield per hectare of wheat was $222, and for opium, it was $12,700. To stop poppy cultivation would require a comprehensive plan to substitute it for another cash crop. It's a long and expensive process. The Taliban method, for all of its immediate successes, ended up pushing many Afghans toward the Americans. When the US touched ground in the fall of 2001, the overthrow of the Taliban came fairly quickly. Conveniently, their fall coincided with the poppy planting season, so farmers just got right back to work. From here, the plan for the US occupation was first and foremost to root out al-Qaeda as well as their collaborators in the Taliban. And within a few months, the Taliban had been largely destroyed. But the Americans wanted to set up a stable liberal democracy in their stead to ensure that Islamic terrorism would not find Afghanistan hospitable again in the near future. A necessary part of this would be to curb drug trafficking, which they were still in a pretty good place to do, as the trade was just in the process of reasserting itself. In fact, the Pentagon had a list of 25 or more drug labs in Afghanistan at this time. Their British allies had a vested interest in eradicating these facilities because Afghanistan was producing 98% of the heroin on their streets. But the Americans refused to bomb the labs because they were owned by the CIA's allies in the anti-Taliban resistance known as the Northern Alliance. These drug traffickers were being paid by the CIA to provide intelligence on Osama bin Laden, so bombing them made no sense. Beyond this, the Americans simply didn't see a relationship between the drug trade and the war on terror. Yet. So much like their operations against the Soviets, the CIA found themselves providing protection to Afghan drug traffickers again. But this isn't to say that no action was ever taken against the heroin trade. Eventually, the Americans would attempt to squash the opium trade in Afghanistan. We can best understand their strategy by analyzing the approach of the Bush, Obama, and Trump presidencies in sequence. As I said a moment ago, the Bush administration originally had a cozy relationship with the drug traffickers and opted not to bomb their facilities. But in their stead, the Brits would spearhead the eradication efforts by starting a $30 million program to pay farmers to destroy their opium. Some farmers harvested their crop, then destroyed what was left to get additional funds from the Brits despite producing the same amount of opium as they would have anyway. And some actually planted more poppies so they could offer to destroy part of their harvest to collect a check from the Brits, then sell the rest of their crop as normal. Meanwhile, the US vacillated over whether to get involved because the CIA didn't want to risk losing their ties to the warlords getting rich off of the drug trade. As the Afghan insurgency continued to gain strength, the Bush administration became convinced that opium was fueling the Taliban, so curbing it was one of the keys to stopping them. As Afghanistan expert Barnett R. Rubin put it,
"We somehow came up with the explanation that it was drugs. The Taliban profit from drugs, and therefore drugs cause the Taliban."
As Rubin implies here, the logic was far from airtight, and I'll explain why in more depth later. But in any case, the US had now officially entered the war on drugs in Afghanistan. They sought to kick things off by spraying herbicides all over the poppy fields to destroy the crops, a practice they had implemented in Colombia previously. However, this project was opposed by the Afghan president Hamid Karzai. He told the Americans that the Afghans would perceive this as chemical warfare against them, which was not entirely wrong. Instead, the Americans implemented Operation Riverdance in March of 2006. This crop eradication plan had tractors flattening opium plots with metal sleds and individual Afghans thwacking plants with sticks to destroy the harvest in Helmand province, the worst offender in the opium trade throughout the war. Both the Americans and Helmand's governor, Mohammed Daoud, immediately celebrated the program as a complete success. The problem was that they were totally lying. The tractors largely got stuck in the mud, and over 80% of the Afghans swinging the sticks abandoned their posts, either because they got their pay and went home, or worse, because the opium farmers offered them 5 times what the government was paying them to actually help them harvest the crops rather than destroy them. So what did this mean for Afghanistan's opium production in 2006? The number of acres being used to grow poppy increased by 59%. In 2007, it went up a further 16%. Perhaps worse yet, their anti-narcotic efforts had stirred up anti-American sentiments among the locals, and Helmand province became the hub for anti-government insurgents. So the Bush administration originally fostered the opium trade by working with the traffickers themselves. Then they ignored the problem for years and let it fester. Once they finally did get involved, the drug trade simply exploded further, and the Taliban exploited the failure to gain a stronger foothold with the locals. This meant that when Obama inherited the war in 2008, he was already dealing with by far the world's foremost producer of heroin by a huge margin. But his administration believed that the eradication efforts of his predecessor were misguided, so they would blaze a new trail. And while switching up tactics was the right move, the results were more of the same. Under Obama, the anti-poppy drive would shift their focus from eradication to an alternative livelihood approach. Under the leadership of Richard Holbrooke, they would attempt to promote legal forms of agriculture and get farmers to grow things like wheat and pistachios. By 2009, opium production had reached its lowest levels in 4 years and stayed flat in 2010. However, this progress appeared to have more to do with the weather than anything else, and opium production would increase by a massive 80% over the next 4 years. To the extent that farmers started growing things like wheat and pistachios, it was a side hustle on top of their full-time of producing poppies. The new irrigation systems provided by the Americans tended to be a huge help for things like this. This is not to say that the Americans had no success, it was all just short-lived. At the very end of the Bush administration, the province of Nangarhar found itself in a good place to curb the drug trade. During the 2004-2005 growing season, the province had 12,990 hectares of land devoted to growing poppies, more than double what it had been the year prior. But by 2007, the price of bread and cereals in the region had increased by 183%, while the price of opium hit its lowest levels since the Taliban had previously banned production. Alongside these economic factors, the governor Gul Agha Shirzai told the citizens that he could not protect them from the wrath of the US forces if they were caught growing poppy, which was almost certainly a bluff. By the end of the 2009 growing season, just 719 hectares of poppy were found, meaning that the cultivation had dropped by an estimated 94%. A huge part of their success here was that, similar to the Taliban before them, officials focused on stopping farmers from planting poppy to begin with rather than destroying the existing crops. But this progress was not built to last. Shirzai's reliance on US forces for protection and enforcement was eventually seen as discrediting in the eyes of his constituents, who would begin to lend their support increasingly to the more radical mujahideen who had achieved fame by fighting the Afghan communists, whose credibility was also undermined by their foreign backers. In addition to the government's weakness, the economic stress of banning opium cultivation came to a head 4 years after it was initially lauded in the West. In some cases, the average Afghan household had 10 mouths to feed, and not enough land to do so by just producing legal cash crops with minimal income substitution coming from local development programs. And when the opium trade began to re-emerge, it quickly became clear that the state did not have the capacity to stop it, resulting in widespread cultivation. So this appeared to be a good faith attempt to overturn the opium trade in Nangarhar before it collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Some have offered a different perspective, however. Journalist turned aid worker and senior advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Sarah Chais, would claim that Governor Shirzai had been instrumental in promoting the opium trade in Kandahar prior to assuming his post in Nangarhar, and that while in charge of the province, the drop in opium cultivation was simply due to the fact that he pivoted from cultivation to processing. Chais said that she received this information directly from sources at NATO's Kabul headquarters, insisting that the Americans were fully aware this was happening. Pakistan had previously done something similar when pressed by the United States to curb opium cultivation and stop making them look bad. If these accusations against Shirzai are true, and I'm inclined to believe that they are, this would have almost certainly hurt his credibility as someone seeking to stop the drug trade in his province. Around the same time, the Obama administration oversaw a similar trajectory in Helmand province, which was the opium capital of Afghanistan. In 2008, the US teamed up with the British to create the Helmand Food Zone in the hopes of shifting agricultural production from opium to things like wheat, much like in Nangarhar. The program appeared to be working, and opium production in the food zone dropped substantially by 2012 thanks to $500 million in US aid money that had poured into the region. However, this progress was in some ways a mirage. The farmers who switched from opium to the far less labor-intensive wheat were able to lay off their farmhands. These guys then moved out to Bogra Canal and started planting, you guessed it, poppies. Journalist Andrew Cockburn would later write that by 2012, the canal was producing more opium than had been reduced in the Helmand Food Zone, thus completely undermining the gains being made. So whether the Obama White House was making good faith efforts to reduce opium production in Afghanistan or not, the drugs just kept on coming. Which brings us to the Trump administration. When Trump ran for president in 2016, one of his major campaign promises was to end the war in Afghanistan. But naturally, he pivoted almost immediately after assuming office. He would tell Americans that his administration conducted a, quote, comprehensive review of the situation and concluded that the right move was to actually send more troops and expand their operations to make things easier for their Afghan allies and government. A major part of this escalation was the fact that the rules of engagement were updated to state that criminal enterprises were now seen as enemy combatants. This meant that instead of having police raid drug labs with military support to make arrests, as had been the custom, the US military would now start bombing drug labs directly, a move that Bush's CIA had once fought against to protect the profits of their assets. And if you believe the figures that were immediately touted by the administration, the operation was a massive success. In his analysis of the strikes, UK researcher David Mansfield would write,
claimed that they inflicted $80 million USD in losses to drug traffickers by destroying 25 labs in the first 24 days of the campaign. They also report losses to the Taliban of $16 million USD that would have been paid in taxes, a tax rate of 20%. Yet, at current prices for heroin, the losses US 4A refer to would amount to almost 73 metric tons of heroin. That's nearly 3 metric tons of heroin in each lab destroyed, with a conversion rate of between 9 and 13.5 kilograms of fresh opium per kilogram of heroin. This would require between 27,000 and 40,500 kilograms of fresh opium per lab. It would mean that the 25 labs destroyed were responsible for converting between 8 to 11% of the entire 2017 crop of 9,000 metric tons.
As Mansfield would go on to demonstrate in his research, almost every single piece of information provided by US 4A here was a complete and total fabrication. Before we even look at the bombings themselves, we can understand these figures to be total hogwash. Even if the US destroyed $80 million worth of product, the Taliban was simply not taxing opium at a rate of 20%. Mansfield pegs the actual figure closer to 0.5% for the value of cooked opium and 1.5% for the value of heroin. So even if the US had destroyed $80 million worth of product, they likely would have only cost the Taliban, at most, $1.2 million. But as Mansfield lays out, the US did not destroy $80 million worth of product. You see, even though Afghanistan flooded the world with heroin, it doesn't mean their labs were just flushed with drugs at any given time. Mansfield and his team interviewed people who worked in the labs that were hit, and they told the researchers that they didn't lose anything of real value. He corroborated this by examining photo and video evidence, as well as through interviews with local kids who scoured the wreckage and only found trace amounts of opium. This makes sense given that the labs would work to order, meaning they would often go days or weeks without refining any drugs at all. When they did work, they didn't tend to leave their product lying around overnight to be stolen or found by police. So most of the supposed labs were just completely inactive at the time they were struck. But hell, even if we assume they were full, the numbers being provided here by the military were impossible. In one instance, the Americans bragged about blowing up 50 barrels in a lab, claiming they were worth millions. Mansfield suggested they were actually worth around $190,000 if converted to heroin, which he estimates would net the Taliban around $2,863. And given that these bombings showed no signs of disrupting the drug trade, the cost for the Taliban and the drug traffickers was minimal. The cost for the Americans, on the other hand, was tenfold that of the traffickers, meaning it was somewhere between 300 to 1,000 times greater than the cost incurred by the Taliban. But most importantly, for the purposes of the war, these airstrikes had a great human cost as well. One of the labs was actually the home of Haji Habibullah, an alleged drug trafficker. When the airstrike hit, it killed Habibullah, his wife, his 7-year-old daughter, his 4 sons between the ages of 3 and 8, as well as his adult daughter and her 1-year-old daughter. The only survivor was his daughter's husband, who had been sleeping in the guest house that night. The tragedy of this was not lost on the locals, who began to resent the Americans for their killing of women and children. Although it got very little coverage in the American press, it caused a stir among Afghan journalists, undermining the US presence further. After over 200 airstrikes, the Americans realized they were spending massive amounts of money with nothing to show for it, so they stopped talking about the program's success, then called it off altogether. So Bush tried to spray pesticides and beat the plants to death with sticks, and under his administration, the Afghan poppy cultivation reached an all-time high. Obama tried to implement crop substitution and incentivize the farmers to grow something else, and under his administration, Afghan poppy cultivation reached an all-time high. Trump decided to play hardball, declare drug traffickers enemy combatants, and blow up their labs along with some women and children as collateral. And wouldn't you know it, under his administration, Afghan poppy cultivation reached an all-time high. The only times in the 20th century that the opium trade in Afghanistan shot down to near zero were in 2001 and 2023, both under the boots of the Taliban. So with this, I want us to think back to how we got here. What does all of this tell us about America's ability to fight a drug war in a foreign country with military force? In the 1970s, Richard Nixon made the war on drugs official. In the years since, the United States has spent billions, funded the killings of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, and yet drugs have continued to proliferate. In the case of heroin specifically, Alfred McCoy wrote,
"After 3 U.S. bilateral drug wars over the past 20 years, the world's illicit opium production increased fourfold, from 990 tons in 1971 to 4,200 tons in 1889. In 1990, for example, a sudden surge in heroin smuggling from Southeast Asia reduced New York City's wholesale price from $100,000 to $60,000 per kilo."
The complete inability of drug war policies to stop the flow of heroin was borne out for 20 consecutive years in Afghanistan. Trump's policies specifically demonstrated that branding drug traffickers as enemy combatants does nothing to stop production. But we saw that across 3 administrations, nothing really seemed to be working. The US approach just fundamentally misunderstood how drug trafficking works. This is not a problem that can be solved by soldiers or airstrikes. It's an economic problem. If you fight to suppress the production of a drug and succeed, that means that there will be less supply in the market, leading to an increase in price. The problem with this is that whether Trump likes it or not, we live in a global economy now. So if you drop drug production in one location to zero and raise the price of it, another location will be incentivized to produce more to take advantage and fill that gap in the market. Meaning that even if America somehow did find all the drug labs in Mexico and destroyed them, which they never would because they probably have assets working in and around them, the cartels would just shift production elsewhere. And if they managed to wipe out the Mexican drug cartels completely, which they wouldn't, the traffickers in other countries would produce more and take their place. That's not to say that nothing should be done. I understand that overdoses associated with opioids like fentanyl have skyrocketed, killing tens of thousands of Americans in recent years. I understand the impulse to want to punish someone for that, but first and foremost, the goal should be to stop this from happening, and whether you like it or not, war is not the answer here. In 1994, the radical leftists over at the Rand Corporation released a study where they laid out how much it would cost each type of cocaine control program to reduce consumption of coke by 1%. They estimated that treatment programs would cost $34 million to do so, which seems like a lot. But domestic drug policing would cost $246 million, interdiction would cost $366 million, and source country control, which is what the Trump administration and Joe Rogan's recent guest list are suggesting, would cost $783 million to reduce cocaine consumption by 1%. That is 23 times more expensive than the treatment option. So if Trump's Department of Government Efficiency is looking for waste, fraud, and abuse, I have a great idea of where to start. To more effectively use taxpayer money, they could try shifting their focus from the supply side to the demand side. They could try redirecting their policy toward providing economic conditions such that people are not ruining their lives with drugs to begin with. They could provide treatment programs to get people off of drugs and off the streets. They could utilize decriminalization to chip away at the power that organized crime holds over the production of these drugs. All of this is cheaper and more efficient than domestic enforcement and interdiction, let alone a full-on invasion of one of your closest neighbors. So why was this idea ever floated to begin with? The short and simple answer is incompetence. If my stock portfolio has taught me anything, it's that Trump just does extremely stupid stuff now, and he seemingly gets no pushback from his flunkies. But I do think there's something else worth considering here. The story of the drug war in Afghanistan is one in which US intelligence enforced their policies unevenly. The fight to suppress poppy harvesting and opium processing was largely framed as a fight to drain the coffers of the Taliban insurgency, but the Americans were happy to protect plenty of their allies who profited off of the drug trade. This included President Hamid Karzai's brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai, a CIA asset well known for his ties to the drug trade before he was assassinated. It also included the former governor of Helmand province, Sher Mohammad Akhundzada, who was found to have 9 tons of opium in his office. In response to this controversy, the British successfully lobbied to have him removed from his post, but he was merely shuffled to a seat in the Afghan Senate, where he would work alongside 17 other alleged drug traffickers working in the Afghan parliament. Akhundzada's case was never investigated, and the New York Times would report that American officials directly interfered with the DEA's attempts to bring him to justice. In fact, by all accounts, the vast majority of the money being made off the drug trade in Afghanistan did not go to the Taliban. By some estimates, they received as little as 4% of the profits, while 75% went to government officials, police, drug traffickers, and whoever else allowed the product to keep moving. So this drug war was not really about drugs at all. It was a pretext to continue fighting against an insurgency that threatened American influence. Which begs the question, when the US is threatening countries like Mexico and Canada over the fentanyl coming over the border, what if it's not really about fentanyl at all? And if fentanyl is just a pretext, what are they really after? Unfortunately, that's a question that goes beyond the scope of this video. If you want to hear what I think the answer is, you can subscribe to our Patreon. You can get 50% off your first month with promo code OPIUM. I promise I will eventually get to Iran as well, but I have a couple other videos in the pipeline that I really want to get through first. We're also trying out a second channel called Burn These B-Sides, where we do more regular, informal content on current events. So check that out if you want to hear more from us. Gladio video is still being worked on, should be out in the next couple months. See ya, nerds.